Let me be very clear about what happened in the Bab el Mandeb Strait between 4 p.m. yesterday and 9 a.m. this morning, because this is not a blockade. This is not a temporary disruption to commercial shipping. This is not even a military operation in the conventional sense that Western naval strategists have been discussing since the USS Carney first engaged Houthi missiles back in October. What it is the operational confirmation of a strategic reality that a small number of analysts, myself included, have been warning about for 8 months while Western policymakers were assuring themselves that freedom of navigation operations and coalition task forces would restore normal maritime commerce. Having spent decades inside rooms where naval strategy is formulated and where the gap between policy objectives and operational capability gets quietly managed before it reaches public discourse, I can tell you with absolute certainty that what the Houthis achieved over the past 17 hours was not improvised resistance. It was the execution of a campaign plan that has been systematically refined through 9 months of iterative learning against the most sophisticated naval forces ever assembled. Stay with me, because by the end of this analysis, you will understand something that is not being discussed in any mainstream outlet. You will understand why this closure represents not a temporary crisis, but a permanent restructuring of global trade architecture. 41 commercial vessels. That is the number of ships that turned around, diverted to alternate routes, or dropped anchor in holding patterns between Djibouti and Oman in the 17-hour window I mentioned. This was not a single spectacular attack creating panic. This was a systematic demonstration of capability that made continued transit through the Red Sea operationally untenable for insurance underwriters and shipping company executives making real-time risk assessments. The Houthis executed coordinated strikes against 3 separate vessels using a combination of anti-ship ballistic missiles, one-way attack drones, and what appears to be a new class of sea-skimming cruise missile that American intelligence had not previously observed in Houthi inventory. None of the 3 targeted vessels was sunk, but that was never the operational objective. The objective was to demonstrate that every vessel transiting the strait faces material risk that no combination of defensive measures and naval escorts can reliably mitigate. The first attack occurred at 4:17 p.m. against a Panamanian flag container ship carrying automotive parts from South Korean manufacturers to European distribution centers. 2 anti-ship ballistic missiles launched from Yemeni territory. The first was intercepted by an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating as part of the multinational task force. The second achieved impact against the vessel's superstructure, causing significant damage to navigation equipment and creating a fire that took 3 hours to contain. 0 fatalities, but the vessel is now disabled and being towed to Djibouti for assessment. The second attack came at 6:43 p.m. against a Greek-owned crude tanker. 4 attack drones in coordinated approach. 3 were engaged by shipboard defensive systems and coalition aircraft. 1 achieved impact. Again, no sinking, but damage sufficient to require the vessel to abort transit and seek port facilities. The third attack, which occurred at 2:15 a.m., involved what Pentagon sources are now describing as a C-802 variant cruise missile, technology that suggests either Iranian supply or significant Houthi technical advancement beyond previous assessments. Most people stop here and focus on the immediate tactical details. They miss what I am about to explain next, which is the strategic mathematics that explain why this 17-hour period represents a permanent shift rather than a temporary escalation. Let me walk you through the economic calculation that every shipping company executive is making right now. The Suez Canal route through the Red Sea reduces Europe-Asia shipping time by approximately 10 days compared to routing around the Cape of Good Hope. That 10-day reduction translates to massive fuel cost savings, faster inventory turnover, and competitive advantage for companies utilizing the route. However, those economic benefits only matter if vessels can transit safely and insurance costs remain manageable. What happened over the past 17 hours has fundamentally altered both variables. Insurance rates for Red Sea transit have increased 17-fold since October. The increase over the past 48 hours alone has been 43%. At current rates, the insurance premium for a single commercial vessel transiting the Red Sea exceeds the cost differential of routing around Africa. That is the economic tipping point where the route becomes financially non-viable regardless of security assurances. But the insurance mathematics only tell part of the story. The larger issue is vessel availability and schedule reliability. When ships divert to alternate routes, they are removed from normal rotation schedules for 3 additional weeks. That creates cascading effects throughout global supply chains that depend on predictable vessel arrival for just-in-time inventory management. European automotive manufacturers, for instance, operate with approximately 7 days of parts inventory. 3-week shipping delays translate directly to production line shutdowns. The 72-hour timeline in this video's title is not hyperbole. It is a realistic assessment of how quickly current inventory buffers will be exhausted if Red Sea commerce remains suspended. European ports have approximately 4 days of container throughput in current storage facilities based on normal consumption rates. Asian manufacturing exports destined for European markets are already in transit through the Suez Canal. If those vessels turn around or remain anchored awaiting security guarantees that cannot be provided, European distribution networks will experience stockouts within 72 to 96 hours. That means empty shelves for consumer electronics, automotive parts, shortages forcing production halts, and industrial supply chain disruptions affecting everything from pharmaceutical manufacturing to construction materials. What comes next is where things take a serious turn, because the question everyone should be asking is why American and European naval forces, which represent the most sophisticated maritime military capability ever assembled, cannot secure a waterway that is 12 miles wide at its narrowest point. The answer to that question explains why this situation is not temporary and why attempted military solutions will fail. The Houthis are employing a strategy that exploits fundamental asymmetries inherent in modern naval warfare. American destroyers carry approximately 90 missiles in their vertical launch cells. Those missiles cost between $2 million and $4 million each, depending on the variant. Houthi anti-ship ballistic missiles cost approximately $100,000 each. Houthi attack drones cost $15,000 to $30,000, depending on sophistication. The cost exchange ratio is 50 to 1 in favor of the attacker. But if you think the cost exchange ratio is the full story, it is not. Because the real asymmetry is not cost, it is magazine depth and reloading capability. An American destroyer that expends its full missile load requires port access for reloading, which takes approximately 48 hours, and removes that vessel from operational area. The Houthis can generate attacks from inland launch sites that are replenished through overland supply routes from Iranian sources. They can sustain attack tempo indefinitely while defensive magazines deplete. This is the same fundamental mathematics problem that Ukraine faces against Russian drone attacks, but applied to a maritime environment where defensive platforms cost $1.8 billion each and cannot be replaced at anything approaching the rate at which cheap offensive systems can be produced. The attempted solution that Western naval planners have deployed is a multinational task force comprising American, British, French, and regional partner vessels. At peak deployment, this task force included 12 major surface combatants and supporting aircraft. That represents billions of dollars in operational costs and the largest concentration of Western naval power in the region since the Gulf War. It has failed to secure the shipping lane, not because of tactical incompetence or lack of effort, but because the mission is structurally impossible given the asymmetry between offensive threat generation and defensive capability. Every successful intercept depletes magazines. Every vessel requiring escort splits defensive resources. Every attack that achieves even minor damage validates the strategy and encourages continued operations. I want to pause here and address what will inevitably be suggested as the solution by voices calling for escalation. The argument will be that this situation requires strikes against Houthi launch sites, command facilities, and supply infrastructure within Yemen. Let me explain exactly why that approach will not work and will likely make the situation worse. The United States and coalition partners have been conducting strikes against Houthi targets since January. Those strikes have not degraded Houthi capability. They have refined it. Every strike creates a learning opportunity for Houthi forces to adapt tactics, disperse assets, and harden critical infrastructure. Meanwhile, strikes against Yemeni territory generate international pressure, create domestic political costs for coalition governments, and provide propaganda victories for Houthi political messaging. The deeper problem is that Houthi capability is not dependent on fixed infrastructure that airstrikes can eliminate. The anti-ship missiles are mobile launchers operating from prepared sites that can be displaced rapidly. The drones are launched from positions that change continuously. The command structure is distributed and redundant. The supply lines run through territory that coalition forces cannot access without ground operations that no Western government is willing to authorize. This is insurgent warfare adapted to a maritime domain, and it exploits every lesson learned from 20 years of American counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Houthis understand that they do not need to win in conventional terms. They need to make the cost of maintaining open shipping lanes intolerably high while demonstrating sufficient capability that commercial operators choose alternate routes regardless of security assurances. Now, let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate impact on European supply chains and fuel costs. Because what we are watching is a fundamental challenge to one of the foundational assumptions of the post-World War II international order. That assumption is that major powers with dominant naval forces can secure critical maritime choke points and ensure freedom of navigation for commercial shipping. That assumption has been operationally valid for 70 years. It is being invalidated in real time by a non-state actor operating with relatively primitive technology and modest external support. That invalidation carries implications far beyond this specific conflict. China is watching the Red Sea situation with acute interest. Chinese strategists have spent 2 decades studying how to challenge American naval dominance in the Western Pacific without engaging in conventional force-on-force conflict that China would likely lose. What the Houthis are demonstrating is that relatively cheap missile and drone systems employed with strategic patience can make maritime domains operationally untenable for commercial shipping despite overwhelming defensive naval presence. That lesson applies directly to scenarios involving Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the broader Indo-Pacific maritime commons. If China concludes that anti-ship missiles and drone swarms can secure de facto control over critical waterways regardless of American carrier strike group presence, the strategic calculations surrounding every contingency scenario in the Pacific shift dramatically. Iran is deriving validation for 3 decades of investment in asymmetric naval warfare capabilities. Iranian military doctrine has emphasized area denial through missile and fast attack craft since the 1980s precisely because conventional naval matching against American forces is impossible. What is happening in the Red Sea demonstrates that Iranian strategic concepts, when supplied to motivated proxy forces, can achieve strategic effects that conventional Iranian naval forces could never accomplish. That validates continued investment and creates template for potential future conflicts in the Persian Gulf, where geography creates even more favorable conditions for asymmetric naval warfare than the Red Sea provides. Russia is observing how Western naval power is being tied down, defending a secondary theater, while Ukraine operations continue. The diversion of Western naval assets to Red Sea escort duty represents ships that cannot be deployed to other contingencies and maintenance cycles that get delayed, creating long-term readiness issues. This is strategic distraction at minimal cost to Russian interests, achieved by a proxy force operating independently of Russian control, but benefiting Russian strategic objectives by consuming Western military resources. Every regional power currently facing Western naval presence is recalculating what is possible with anti-ship missiles and unmanned systems. This includes North Korea, which has invested heavily in coastal defense missiles and submarine launch systems. This includes various non-state actors throughout the Middle East and North Africa who have observed Houthi success and are drawing conclusions about what can be achieved with Iranian technology transfer. This includes future contingencies that have not yet developed, but where control of maritime choke points will determine outcomes. The demonstration effect will ripple through the next decade of maritime security challenges in ways that Western naval planners are only beginning to comprehend. Stay with me because this final section explains what happens next and why the situation is likely to get worse before it gets better, if it gets better at all. The immediate economic impact on Europe is the leading indicator of broader systemic stress. European economies are already experiencing inflation pressure, energy cost challenges, and industrial competitiveness issues. The disruption of Asian supply chains adds another layer of economic stress that compounds existing challenges. Consumer goods prices will increase. Manufacturing costs will rise. Industrial production will face interruptions, creating unemployment pressure. These economic effects will manifest politically through pressure on governments to either restore normal shipping routes through military action or negotiate with actors that Western governments have designated as terrorists. Neither option is politically palatable, but the economic pressure will force decisions. The strategic situation is even more challenging. The Houthis have demonstrated a capability that cannot be eliminated without ground operations that will not be authorized. They have established that Red Sea transit involves material risk that commercial operators are unwilling to accept. That means alternate routing becomes permanent rather than temporary, which means permanent increase in global shipping costs, permanent reduction in supply chain efficiency, and permanent strategic leverage for actors who can threaten maritime choke points. The Suez Canal will remain open, but commercial traffic will decline to levels that make the canal economically non-viable for Egypt, creating secondary economic crisis with political implications. The longer-term implication is that we are entering an era where control of maritime commons cannot be taken for granted even by dominant naval powers. That represents a fundamental shift in how global trade operates and how economic interdependence is structured. For 70 years, the assumption has been that oceans connect economies and that dominant naval powers ensure that connectivity remains secure. We are transitioning to an environment where oceans can be controlled by actors with modest capabilities if they are willing to accept sustained operations and if defending powers are unwilling to engage in unlimited escalation. That transition has profound implications for how global supply chains are organized, how industrial capacity is distributed, and how economic security is conceptualized. Western policymakers need to understand that this is not a problem that can be solved through additional naval deployments or expanded strike operations. This is a structural challenge that requires fundamental rethinking of how maritime security is achieved in an era of cheap precision weapons and distributed threat networks. The current approach, which assumes that sufficient military presence will eventually restore normal commerce, is strategically inadequate. What is required is recognition that we have entered a new era of maritime competition where traditional concepts of sea control are being challenged by asymmetric strategies that exploit economic rather than military vulnerabilities. If this analysis has helped you understand why the Red Sea closure is not a temporary crisis but a systematic challenge to global trade architecture, then share this video. Share it with anyone making investment decisions based on assumptions about supply chain stability, with anyone advocating for military solutions without understanding the strategic mathematics involved, with anyone who believes that dominant naval power automatically translates to control of maritime space. Subscribe if you are not already, because the people who are going to navigate what comes next are the ones who understand that comfortable assumptions about how the world works are being systematically challenged by adversaries who have studied our vulnerabilities and found the seams. Leave your thoughts below. Tell me what you believe is the most consequential implication of Houthi success in closing the Red Sea. Is it the immediate economic impact on Europe, the demonstration effect for other regional actors, the challenge to American naval dominance, or the long-term restructuring of global supply chains? I read everything you write, and these conversations matter because understanding these structural shifts is how we adapt to realities that policymakers are not yet willing to acknowledge. Stay informed, stay clear-eyed, because what is happening in the Red Sea is not an isolated maritime security incident. It is a preview of how 21st century great power competition will be fought in the spaces between conventional warfare and economic interdependence, and understanding that transformation is essential for anyone trying to make sense of where the international system is heading.